basic memory was tussles with the other radical students.
At City College, there was an atmosphere of perfervid, overly heated, overly excited intellectuality.
If one didn't feel like going to class, one would cut and go to the alcove. There was always someone there with whom you could talk, and usually with whom you could argue.
Those who went to City College during the 1930s in a highly politicized environment were very, very much aware of the crisis that the entire world, not just the United States, was going through. And the rise of totalitarianism, communism, fascism were things that they were deeply interested in. City College was like a school for political disputation.
More than 50 years ago, 4 young radicals began arguing politics with one another at the City College of New York. In argument, they discovered the world. Through the power of their ideas, they hoped to change it.
Ever since I can remember, I've been a neo-something. A neo-Marxist, a neo-Trotskyist, a neo-liberal, a neo-conservative. In religion, always neo-Orthodox, even while I was a neo-Trotskyist and a neo-Marxist. I'm going to end up a neo. Just neo, that's all. Neo-nothing.
I think that one of the difficulties that we face today is that there is a deep moral and intellectual crisis of the American ruling class. Don't ask me who the ruling class is. Whoever it is. It's in a deep crisis.
You know who you are.
But I see you've got an article, your lead piece, called Who Owns the Future? And I don't know if you know that Irving Kristol wrote a piece a few years ago called Who Owns the Future? I suppose that's everybody's patent, that they claim the future. Problem is, who's the who? I mean, the future, we know what that is. It's all bleak.
If you were to ask me, I would tell you, when I came to Berkeley in 1964, I still thought of myself as a man of the left on a number of grounds. But they were grounds that could well have been from the right.
A powerful critic of liberal welfare policy and an eminent sociologist, Nathan Glazer has done pioneering work on ethnic identity. Irving Kristol is a political essayist and a key intellectual architect of the Reagan and Gingrich revolutions. A literary critic and leading voice of the left, Irving Howe has dedicated his life to keeping the socialist idea alive. Daniel Bell is a man of the liberal center. A major social theorist, his work has been pivotal to our understanding of the late 20th century. As young men, they were drawn into the world of the New York intellectuals, a brilliantly contentious circle of writers and critics who combined a love for art and literature with an equal passion for politics.
If I try to think about the New York intellectuals, and specifically about these 4 New York intellectuals, one of the most striking things about them, and which distinguishes them from their academic peers and from some of their successors, both left and right, is a way of thinking about the world. You can't begin to analyze, say, the most recent strike in Detroit without starting from the division of labor in ancient Babylonia and working your way up. And that's the context. The context is world history. And the questions that you bring to your analysis of this specific event are the largest questions. Where are we going? Where have we been?
They came from working class families, and they made their way on, the children made their way on their wits.
Growing up in the Jewish world of New York, even though one had religious education, did not make one primarily religious, it made one more alert to the world. It was a kind of double consciousness. We'd go to school and we'd sing "My Country, 'Tis of Thee, Sweet Land of Liberty." Land where my fathers died, people say, Russia. Land of the Pilgrim's Pride, Jerusalem. From every mountainside, the Alps.
The immigrant Jews brought with them memories of the old country, legends and stories about things that have happened there. So you absorbed this kind of historical consciousness at the kitchen table, literally at the kitchen table.
still there.
Is
Right
that
now-
it? Is
right
that
now-
the one with the murals?
Yeah, that's the one with the
You know,
murals.
after 50 years, you sort of forget the details, you know.
50 years?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say that's what it is, yes.
Yeah.
I wish it was shorter, but
Yeah.
it isn't.
So what type of professor? are you?
Well, I'm professor of sociology at Harvard.
At Harvard?
Yeah, we lived here from the time I was 10 to about the time I was 19. Then we moved to the West Bronx.
You know General Colin Powell used to
I
live
know
over
that. Now, he's much more famous than me. I'm not famous at all.
Everybody's a star.
Yeah, well, we all do
Right.
our best. I used to live at 758, which was over there near the school, and that's torn down.
That's my school.
Is that your, what school, what's the number that's, what school is it?
60.
What?
PS 60.
PS 60, where is that?
Over there.
Uh-huh, that's PS 60, okay. Well, you would have been, we used to go to, this is wonderful. You know who did that? Do you know when they put it up?
That was a long time.
That's a double Dutch sculpture. And we just saw some real good double Dutch work. My father was a garment worker, working ladies' garments. I have a picture of myself at 5 or 6, and that was a suit that my father had made for me. There were 9 of us in 4 rooms at first, and then we lived to another place in East Harlem, which was 5 rooms, and up here you could get 6 or 7 rooms for less money. These buildings had large apartments, and they would run 6 or 7 rooms to the back. And so you really could, we really could spread out. So it was like moving to the wide open spaces.
So how does it feel to be back here?
I don't know yet. I think sometimes there's a story of a man who'd been away from Russia about 50 years. He comes to Leningrad, St. Petersburg. He looks around, he puts down his valise. He looks around and he says, "Oh, Russia, how you've changed." He looks down, the valise disappeared. He says, "Oh, Russia, how you haven't changed." And that building looks very familiar.
I grew up on the Lower East Side before the housing projects and before the highway. And there used to be these long piers jutting out into the river. In the summertime, we used to swim between the piers. There's something called slack. I don't know if you ever heard that word, slack. Slack is the season when nothing is there. But there's also the busy season. So the world is divided into slack and busy. Since my mother was a dressmaker, there were certain seasons of the year where she'd be working 8, 10, 12 hours a day. And I would be put into what was then called a day orphanage, but actually quite often I'd spend the night there because my mother couldn't come home in time to feed us. So that, and my older brother would be with my grandparents, and they couldn't take care of both of us. I was called the Wilde. I was the wild one. He was the more quiet one, so my grandparents didn't want to have me in the house, they say. So I would roam the streets or come back.
We were poor, that's all, but then everyone was poor, more or less. When poverty is near universal, you don't experience it as poverty particularly. So our rooms were very small. We had very few of them. Shared a bedroom with my sister for a while. Then I slept in the hall. Then I slept in the dining room. It didn't matter because everyone was doing that. I'm amused to watch television shows these days where the parents go around hugging their kids saying, "I love you." I want to tell you that never happened in the families I knew in Brooklyn in those days. You would be embarrassed if one of your parents came up and said, "I love you." I mean, what are you supposed to say to that? No, but absolute trust, absolute loyalty, absolute commitment, and that's what family was.
My folks had a grocery store. It went bankrupt. They had to move in with my grandmother in a cramped apartment with many people there. For many years, I didn't have a room of my own. We were very close to destitution. The most vivid memory I have of the Depression is that my family moved from the West Bronx to the East Bronx. That may seem like a trivial thing, but it was a drop in social ascent. The West Bronx was the middle-class area. The East Bronx was the working-class area. And for a kid of 11 or 12, the transition was very difficult and perplexing and painful. The thought of a career or future was not something which one could live by. The expectation that one's parents could bring in enough money next week by which to live was very small. There was a sense of chaos, disintegration, and it was a perfectly normal thing for a kid with some sort of introspectiveness and intellectuality, such as it was, to turn to politics. The socialist view, the radical view, seemed to bring to young people a total understanding. It seemed to suggest a conceptual frame by which one could structure and give meaning to these very difficult experiences.
The answer to unemployment in the final analysis is nothing less than worldwide socialism. The answer to the troubles that beset us is worldwide socialism. But on that road to that glorious goal, there are things we can do now. Now to break the back of this misery, which rests like a curse on people in every hamlet, in every city, and every town of America. 'Tis a final conflict.
In 1932, socialist candidate Norman Thomas, heir to the party's great leader Eugene V. Debs, wins nearly 1 million votes in the presidential election. Many of his supporters are New York's Jewish immigrants and their children. For centuries, the Jewish world had been almost completely defined by religious faith. Socialism, with its world-embracing vision, struck young Jews with the force of a new and more powerful revelation. From the ravages of capitalism, a just society would be built. Working men and women would take their place as leaders of a new world. Society's wealth would be shared by everyone.
We found a shul, and right over there is where the Socialist Party headquarters used to be, and that framed my life, the shul and the Socialist Party. When I had my bar mitzvah, there was a Malamed who taught me my Haftorah. I said to him, I found the truth. I don't believe in God. I'll put on tefillin once in memory of my dead father, but that's all. I'm joining the Young People's Socialist League. So he looked at me and said, Yingo, kid, you found the truth. You don't believe in God. He says, tell me, you think God cares? Well, I was so angry at that. Coming out of an immigrant world in which one's parents were preoccupied with making a living, preoccupied with the day-to-day existence, who are not illiterate but not basically cultured. And suddenly the world opens up. And this is what the socialist movement did for me. It suddenly shows there's a world of ideas, a world of experience, a world of imagination, so that one eagerly, one becomes almost greedy in reaching for this.
The socialist idea that inspired Bell and Howe had first appeared more than 100 years earlier. By mid-century, Karl Marx had produced an all-embracing theory of capitalism that claimed to reveal the economic forces which shaped history. Marxism predicted the inevitable rise to power of the working class. And then, in 1917, Vladimir Lenin and his small band of communists had seized power in Russia in the name of the workers. In America, many joined the newly created Communist Party. Though a rivalry began between communists and socialists, the revolution convinced many in both parties that Marxism was the answer and that a socialist state could become a reality in America.
Socialism had been a theory all along, and even though there were big socialist parties in Germany and countries like that, nobody had ever come to power. And suddenly the Bolsheviks seized power in the most unexpected and dramatic way. The Bolshevik Revolution was wildly exciting to all kinds of socialists and leftists because it was the first success.
Even those not politically active absorbed the radical atmosphere that permeated life, from garment workers' unions to Yiddish language newspapers. Nathan Glazer's father read the Forward, a socialist paper, and voted for Norman Thomas. Irving Kristol learned about radical politics from his older sister, who took him to the protest plays of Clifford Odets.
In those days, the streets were filled with crowds listening to street speakers. And all these meetings were attended by people who would attack the speaker when he got finished, or ask him to answer questions. And there were often fights.
A good street corner speaker could go on for 3/4 of an hour. I rarely lasted more than 20 minutes, even if that long. I had a certain gift. I could lose an audience in about 3 minutes.
When I joined the Ipsos, this was 1932, Norman Thomas was running for president, and a group of us would go from corner to corner with sort of a stepladder and begin gathering a crowd until our main speaker would come along and talk. We needed some way of getting the crowds together. I was usually the first one up the ladder, and I would speak, and I had to speak for about 10 minutes.
The essential thing for a street corner speaker is to work the back and forth relationship, the give and take, because the audience in the street corner is not one that just stands quietly. It participates, it joins in, it heckles.
Well, you don't know very much when you're 13 years old and you have to speak for 10 minutes. So I pretty much memorized the last section of The Jungle, which is Eugene Victor Debs' speech. And people would say, how eloquent he is. And there's nothing like that kind of applause and reinforcement to make you feel good. And I would sort of imitate the gestures of Debs, who would speak this way with his finger out. You've seen these pictures sometimes of Debs speaking, long, lean man with his finger out. And I'd lean out to the audience, and people would sort of shrink back almost, and I'd almost pull them in.
The only thing specific I can remember is hearing a Republican speak. Imagine a Republican in East Harlem in 32, and feeling a certain degree of sympathy for Herbert Hoover. And this was very surprising to me. I had never, who had heard of a Republican and who knew about Herbert Hoover's trials and tribulations.
Like most young people with some political consciousness in the 1930s, I assumed the world was coming to an end, and there would be no point in preparing oneself for a profession. I knew absolutely nothing about City College. All I knew about it was that it was free. So even though I had a very good high school record, I took it for granted that always that I would go to City College, and I went.
Students join on a nationwide protest against war. Here are scenes at City College. Peaceful, what? Nothing like having a riot to work up that anti-war spirit.
City College in Harlem was a school for the brightest of the city's poor. Swelling applications during the Depression made its all-male student body nearly the equal of Harvard, though a good deal more radical. Columbia, the city's most prestigious college, trained the Protestant elite, and the few Jews it accepted were usually wealthy German Jews.
Columbia was for the genteel. It was sort of out there, with never had a feeling of what Columbia was. Harvard was even much further out, totally abstract. City College was very vivid and real.
I was a kid. I was 16 years old when I first went to City College. On the one hand, I had visions of great political activity. On the other hand, I was afraid of integral and differential calculus. And as it turned out, I had very good reason to be afraid of it. The atmosphere was dingy. The place needed the paint jobs. The teachers were overworked. Many of them were mediocre. It wasn't a very distinguished faculty at all. But there was an atmosphere of perfervid, overly heated, overly excited intellectuality.
Each day, a small group of students, often cutting class, would make their way to an alcove in the school cafeteria looking to talk and maybe argue. about Marx, about the Soviet state he'd inspired, or about the idea of revolution.
The alcoves were little divisions shaped like a horseshoe in which students could sit and eat their lunch.
It was regarded as profligate to go out and actually buy lunch. And no one had the money in any case. So we all brown bagged it. And we would sit there and eat lunch and talk.
Most of the teachers were old dodos, and we educated ourselves. We liked to talk to one another, argue, debate. But it became a kind of cheder. It's a place where you constantly were disputing.
We used to use the phrase, having a discussion. Having a discussion meant something rather special in those days. It meant a fairly passionate interchange, arguing about some interpretation or what have you, and doing it at the top of your lungs.
One of the chief things we had to waive in our arguments was the New York Times. As in the expression, even the New York Times admits or asserts or says.
Every alcove had its own identity. There was the jock alcove for the athletes, alcoves for the ROTC people. I don't think I ever met one. The Catholic alcove, and I don't think I ever met anyone there either. I mean, you know, we did ghettoize ourselves. But basically our life at City College was concentrated as between Alcove 1 and Alcove 2. The anti-Stalinist left and the Stalinist left. And that was our world.
At City College, Irving Kristol and Irving Howe had fallen under the spell of a Soviet revolutionary exiled in Mexico, Leon Trotsky. Small in number, the Trotskyists gathered in Alcove 1 with their radical cohorts, socialists like Bell and members of a host of tiny splinter groups. In a few years, a left-wing Zionist named Nathan Glazer would join the alcove. Contentious, each defending the purity of his own radical beliefs, they were united solely by their opposition to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and his American communist followers who made their home in Alcove 2.
Members of the Young Communist League, and they must have numbered somewhere between 200 and 400, were forbidden to talk to us. I mean, literally forbidden by their organization to have a conversation.
We had one fellow who had a foghorn voice, and he would hold up a left-wing paper and yell, "Read about Stalin the Butcher." And they would become very aggravated and aroused, and sometimes we would just literally provoke them into entering a debate or discussion.
There was a debate between Seymour Melman and the communists, and Melman held forth for something like 6 or 8 hours as various people rose up against him, and then had to go to class.
Someone made a wisecrack that the only place where the fight between Stalin and Trotsky could be conducted freely was in New York City.
The fight at City College over Stalin was an argument that had agitated radical circles for years. Did the Communist Party rule in the interests of the people? Stories from the Soviet Union told of forced labor camps and political executions. The ousted revolutionary Trotsky claimed that Stalin was a dictator bent on destroying all political opposition. In 1936, a series of trials began in Moscow. One after another, the revolutionary elite pled guilty to charges of foreign espionage and were executed. Trotsky was sentenced to death in absentia. For the anti-Stalinist left, the Moscow trials raised alarming new questions about the world's first socialist state. Lenin had promised that in seizing power, the Communist Party would bring democracy and economic justice. Yet the revolution had led to Stalin.
The experience of the Moscow trials, many of us thought about a great deal. What was the larger significance of all of this?
Here were all the major figures who had created the Russian Revolution being murdered by Stalin, not only being murdered, but being forced in an abject way to confess to the most ludicrous kinds of accusations, that they're agents of the Gestapo, agents of Germany.
I think many of the ideas that we developed were largely worked out in response to those highly traumatic experiences. And it wasn't just that some tyranny had been established, but that this tyranny arose out of a movement which was supposed to bring social justice to the world.
One of the reasons intellectual life in Alcove 1 was so interesting was that so much of it was internal self-examination. We were not just denouncing the bourgeois world or capitalism. In fact, we really didn't spend that much time on it. It was much more interesting trying to figure out our own radicalism, and particularly that absolutely overwhelming question that haunted us, namely, was there something in Marxism and in Leninism that led to Stalinism?
We were raising some of the most fundamental ethical and moral problems of politics, though we wouldn't have put it that way. We had no awareness that we were engaged in such lofty enterprises.
I myself did not join the Young Trotskyists till shortly after I left college, but I had been a fellow traveler for about 3 years. If anyone recruited me, I suppose you can say it was Irving Howe. He recruited me, one might say. He also expelled me about a year later for coming to the conclusion that, in fact, there was an organic connection between Leninism and Stalinism.
I made a big mistake with Irving Kristol, and that was recruiting him to begin with. He wasn't, let's say, good material, but he wasn't expelled. He was together with a little group which developed different ideas, dissonant ideas, and they left. I don't think they were expelled.
Looking beyond City College, the radicals of Alcove 1 watched with growing concern as fascism swept through Europe. In 1935, Stalin, fearful of the new threat, used anti-fascist sentiment to sell his communist cause. Directing communists across the world to join with others on the left, he tried to create and control a grand alliance against fascism called the Popular Front. Communists suddenly shed their radical image. American communist leaders backed Franklin Roosevelt and his liberal reforms. Thousands joined the Communist Party, and growing numbers of fellow travelers became sympathetic to the Soviet cause.
The non-Stalinist left found the Popular Front extraordinarily sickening, rather nauseating.
The anti-Stalinists of Alcove 1 were outnumbered by the Communists and their Popular Front supporters. Yet their beliefs were echoed by a group of young Greenwich Village intellectuals and found expression in the magazine they wrote for, Partisan Review.
I'd never heard of Partisan Review before I went to City College, and the first issue of Partisan Review I ever saw was in Melman's hands. And I said, what's that? And he said, oh, this is very important, you have to read this. You know, that's the way we talk.
The Stalinists were middlebrow. The Trotskyists were highbrow because they thought in kind of terms that you had when Partisan Review started coming out. The union of two avant-gardes, a political avant-garde and a cultural avant-garde. We prided ourselves on reading Joyce and Thomas Mann and Proust, maybe not completely, but at least dipping in, whereas they were reading palookas like Howard Fast.
A militantly anti-Stalinist journal, Partisan Review was dedicated to combining literary modernism with Marxist politics. Its first issues included pieces by T.S. Eliot, Wallace Stevens, Edmund Wilson, and Leon Trotsky. But its core was a small group of young writers and critics in New York's Greenwich Village, isolated in the midst of the Popular Front's overwhelming influence among intellectuals. Partisan Review had begun life under communist auspices, but its editors, William Phillips and Philip Rov, had soon chafed under the party's heavy-handed control and its attacks on avant-garde literature.
We felt that if radicalism is to be desirable in any way, to be fulfilling in any way, it's had to come together with and represent in a way the farthest reaches and the most profound forms of modern consciousness.
It was very extraordinary to find a magazine and a group of people who shared one's left-wing anti-communism, one's, if I may put it that way, one's advanced notions about books and the arts.
In their battles with the Stalinists and the Popular Front, they felt that the Stalinists had very little feeling for human nature, very little feeling for human autonomy and individuality. And they saw those qualities par excellence in literature and in culture.
There were these essays that everyone felt they had to read. They weren't essayists in a classic sense of graceful and discursive. It was concentrated analysis. Presented us with an ideal. I know my first book reviews had to include in it everything, that was relevant, everything about the world.
We got a general cultural education of a limited kind, nothing before 1900. But in 20th century literature and art, we ended up getting a much better education, I think, than most college students get these days. And it all began out of a political impulse.
The denizens of Alcove 1 found in Partisan Review a new intellectual world. They glimpsed through it the possibility of a life devoted to writing. The PR critics were, above all, politically engaged intellectuals. For them, as for the boys of City College, there was perhaps no better example of this than Leon Trotsky. He was both revolutionary hero and writer, a man who had led the Soviet army and also produced a brilliant stream of essays on everything from literature to revolution.
He had a literary verve, which was unmistakably was a great journalist, and the intellectual power of his criticism of the Stalin regime, most of which is accepted nowadays as justified, that he was right. But we didn't know he was right. We knew he was interesting. And in a way, if you lived in the village, what was interesting was right. Certainly the uninteresting was wrong. I'm not willing to altogether give that up, even today.
Our life was bounded by the boundaries of the village. It was not just the geographical region of the Communist Party, it was the region of Bohemia.
The village was like a village. Not a place for promiscuity. It was a place of refuge from the promiscuity of social life, in the sense that you could see the kind of people whom you like to see, and not businessmen.
In August 1939, the era of the Popular Front came to a sudden end when Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Adolf Hitler. American communists quickly abandoned their alliance with Roosevelt. A week later, Germany invaded Poland, and the Second World War began. In 2 years' time, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, and communists proclaimed the Popular Front once again. The Communist Party's constantly shifting policies confirmed the anti-Stalinist left in their belief that the party was being manipulated to suit Stalin's own needs. They were convinced that only a worldwide revolution by workers could destroy Hitler. In December 1941, America entered the war and they were forced to confront their radical beliefs. Could they support capitalist America in its fight against Hitler? It was a question that each would have to answer in his own way.
America went to war against Hitler. You say, I'm anti-American, I don't like this country, it's a dreadful country. But then how do you explain it went to war against Hitler? Was it only to save capitalism? Nonsense. The country showed itself a nation committed to certain ideals. So how could you ignore the most obvious fact of one's life? That there'd been a war against fascism and this country had stood for it.
Irving Kristol spent the war as a soldier in southern France. Irving Howe in Alaska. The new leader hired Daniel Bell as its managing editor, while Nathan Glazer finished college.
After the war, suddenly things were possible that seemed utterly impossible. I came out of the Army convinced that the economy was going to collapse, instead of which we took off in this wonderful boom. People of my generation could buy a home, could own a car. I must understand, I never owned a car. No one I knew owned a home. And started having families. Didn't have to live with their in-laws. I'd lived in Brooklyn all of my life, as had my wife. For me, coming to Manhattan, which was the city, was liberation. We always referred to Manhattan as the city. We're going to the city. Brooklyn was pleasant, but dull. Well, I never had any firm ambitions at that age. I did have one, to get out of Brooklyn.
I had been partly transformed by my experiences in the Army. I spent 2 years in Alaska. It was like a graduate school for me. During that time, I read a good many books. There was nothing else to do up there. I began to develop incipient literary inclinations to move away from being just political. And I began to contribute a book review here, a book review there.
In the course of my life, I've discovered that work keeps on increasing. Commentary routines have plenty of time. We even played chess.
In 1945, Nathan Glazer became an assistant editor on Commentary, a new magazine of politics and culture funded by a leading Jewish organization. The magazine included many of the partisan review group among its writers. He met fellow City College graduate Irving Kristol the following year when he joined its editorial staff.
Nat and I, of course, were very close. We used to play chess during our lunch hours and talk about anything and everything.
And simultaneously, I was taking courses at Columbia, evening courses or late afternoon courses, and thinking I would, vaguely, I would be a sociologist. There was a kind of a sense of hope in the social sciences that they would really give us answers to problems.
I became the religion editor at Commentary, since I was the only member of the staff who was really interested in what rabbis thought. And so they'd give me the rabbis' articles to rewrite. You couldn't edit them, they had to be rewritten. But I liked that.
During the war years, I was constantly working, constantly on the go. I started a first book then. It was called A Monopoly State, dealing with the way in which the economy is becoming a war economy. And I would go up to the 42nd Street Library and work there in the evenings doing research, come back. And then having written about 150 pages, which I still have in my basement, I thought, what do I know about this? Who am I kidding? This is silly. I took books seriously, so I abandoned it.
I remember going up to the offices of Partisan Review and being received by Philip Roth in a rather gruff but friendly manner. He handed me the chance to do a review, and that was a big opportunity, as it seemed, and in fact it was.
Writing for Partisan Review became a kind of symbol of achievement.
Inspired by Partisan Review, they were beginning to write for it. And by the late 40s, the Partisan Review group was becoming widely known through the influence of literary critics Lionel Trilling, F.W. Dupee, Alfred Kazin, Lionel Abel, Philip Rave, William Phillips, and Diana Trilling. Art critics Clement Greenberg, Harold Rosenberg, and Meyer Shapiro were championing a new school of painters, the abstract expressionists. Writers Delmore Schwartz, Mary McCarthy, and Saul Bellow were being recognized. The political journalism of Dwight MacDonald was reaching a wider audience, and Sidney Hook had become a noted philosopher. And now they had been joined by a younger generation. They would become known as the New York Intellectuals. Questioning old political beliefs, they were struggling to understand the world from a new, more uncertain place, and beginning to produce some of their most original work.
One of the characteristics, first, of this group was the notion of its universal competence. Culture, politics, whatever was going, we shut our mouths off on. I did. And as a model created by an initial arrogance that if you're a Marxist, you can understand anything, as a model that even as we gave up our Marxism, we nevertheless stuck with.
Marxism had given the New York intellectuals a worldview and a sense of political purpose. But as they were coming to understand, it had also blinded them to America.
One of the things that made us distant from America was the fact that we weren't Democrats or Republicans. That's certainly a way of distancing yourself from your culture and its politics if you don't participate in any element of it. That distancing was beginning to break down.
The Army, for me, was a very profound education. I was a New York Jewish kid. I didn't know anything about America, and I didn't know anything about most ordinary people. And I realized that, to create a new socialist person, which was our ideal, was probably a utopian enterprise.
I think the crucial thing for them was their de-radicalization, because they carried over a great deal of the cast of mind of Marxism. But within that cast of mind, they had to develop a personal viewpoint. After the war, many of the things that had long been of interest to Partisan Review became very important to America. Europe was the most important of those things. Communism was very important. In a way, the anti-communism of the New York intellectuals was prophetic of the direction that the entire country took after the war. Partisan Review was the place to find what was going on in new currents in European thought, such as existentialism.
The atmosphere of Partisan Review was both exciting because of the wealth of their interests and insular because of the nature of these people themselves. They were so polemical-minded.
These were people for whom ideas mattered more than almost anything else, in many cases more than personal relations, for example.
Ideas meant defending the ideas, promoting the ideas, arguing. We were always arguing with each other, but within certain premises, which made us a community.
They were stuck in the sense that there was almost no one else outside this particular world who was capable of participating in the kind of discussion that went on in that world, and that was everyone's passion and lifeblood. You needed to have read a great deal and certain kinds of things. You needed to have a certain kind of mind. You needed to be brilliant, and brilliant meant very quick, able to see and make connections, able to win arguments with other very smart people. And everyone was brilliant in that way.
These people didn't know how to behave. Intellectuals knew how to think, but they didn't know how to behave.
They were all critics with the capital C, and they were critics of everything, especially of each other. I always felt when I went to a Parliament Review party, if I went to the bathroom for a moment, they would start attacking me as a matter of course.
My major memory of a dinner party, I got a plate full of food and there was a couch. And so I walked over and sat down in the middle of the couch, not knowing who was going to join me, not really much caring. Well, what happened was that Mary McCarthy sat down on one side of me, Hannah Arendt sat down on the other side of me, and then Diana Trilling pulled up a chair and sat facing me. And I was a prisoner. I couldn't get out. And they then had a long hour-and-a-half discussion on Freud, in which they disagreed, and I don't remember what the disagreement was about. All I know is I sat there quiet and terror-stricken.
Unless a man in the intellectual community was bent on sexual conquest, he was never interested in women. He wanted to be with the men. They always wanted to huddle in a corner to talk.
I was so impressed and sort of heart-pounding at the idea of meeting these people that had been heroes or enigmas to me, to see the Trillings, to see Saul Bellow, to argue, listen, and see and hear things for the first time was thrilling. Over-thrilling in a way.
I think I was less argumentative and less assertive than let us say, the most argumentative and assertive ones. It maybe in other contexts brought out my those qualities, but there I was a junior member, and I felt it.
For a couple of years, I led a somewhat ambivalent life, two-sided. On the one hand, I was still involved in the little left-wing group, although more and more uncomfortable within it. And at the same time, I was involved in this world of the New York intellectuals, though not entirely at ease there either. And then that began to change.
Howe remained a revolutionary far longer than his City College friends, until he too abandoned his youthful dreams. Unlike them, however, he continued to see himself as a radical and dedicated himself to the political ideal of democratic socialism. For Kristol, Glazer, and Bell, growing skepticism about utopian politics further undermined their radical beliefs.
On the personal level, emotional level, reading Weber, reading Dostoevsky's The Possessed, all of these made clear that the radical absolutist position was going to be not only self-defeating, but lead to some horrifying results. Goes back to a theme Irving, Kristol and I used to discuss, that utopia was necessary as a standpoint, but the effort to realize on Earth involved distortions which were dreadful.
In the years after the war, revelations from the Soviet Union grew worse. There were continuing stories of political persecution and new reports of mass deaths. Stalin's power grew to encompass Eastern Europe. Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, and half of Germany fell to communist parties largely under his control.
The expansion of Stalinist power was a very alarming thing. What one felt was this: one totalitarian monster had been destroyed in the war, and for a moment afterward there was a sense of exhilaration and relief, and now there was another one, and it seemed we would never be done with it.
The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
Increasingly bitter relations between America and the Soviet Union grew into Cold War. The American Communist Party, though much smaller in the late 40s, continued to remain active. Hidden from view, they largely controlled the 1948 presidential campaign of anti-Cold War candidate Henry Wallace. The following year, a communist-organized peace conference attracted a number of liberal intellectuals and celebrities.
People were attracted to the Communist Party who did not necessarily regard themselves as handmaidens of Stalin. But what made the Communist Party unique as compared to any other political party of any consequence I can think of in the whole history of the country is that it was directed and to some extent financed by a foreign power.
Alarmed at communist influence in the liberal community, Kristol, Bell, and Glazer joined the American Committee for Cultural Freedom, which had been created to organize intellectuals against the party.
It wasn't that the American communists were the Trojan horse of Soviet Russia. It was rather that they muddied the waters of understanding of what the Soviet Union was and what our interests were and where we should stand in regard to the Soviet Union. And that was a problem with domestic communism. That's why you had to argue with them.
You would think that the shift of America towards anti-communism, towards an understanding similar to their own of how bad Stalin was and how bad communist Russia was, you'd think that this would be the greatest thing that ever happened to them. But the anti-communism of America in the 50s was not exactly the anti-Stalinism that they had held as a principled position. They were faced both with a country that had gone in the direction of their interests, but in a way caricatured their interests, even as it found many new uses for them.
Are you a member of the Communist Party? It's unfortunate and tragic that I have to teach this committee the basic principles of Americanism. That's not the question.
As fears of the Soviet Union rose during the Cold War, opportunistic politicians launched a series of widely publicized anti-communist congressional hearings. From those in the party's influence in Hollywood to a series of statewide investigations into communism on college campuses. The threat of espionage soon magnified fears when communists Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were arrested, found guilty, and executed for giving atomic secrets to the Soviet Union.
Answer that yes or no. Do you know this man?
I will not answer it yes or no. My answer to the question is...
You are ordered to answer it.
In 1950, Senator Joseph McCarthy gained national notoriety with his own hearings into communist subversion in government.
The answer to the question is no.
Though critical of the congressional investigations, many New York intellectuals continued to believe that communism posed a danger to American political life and kept up a vigorous opposition to it.
We thought the influence of communists, wherever they were pernicious in intellectual life, in the mass media, and so on. Our orientation would be basically to write articles. and I come back then to the problem of McCarthy. As you write articles, there'll be consequences. And consequences that you yourself are not advocating, but others will implement.
Are you a member of the Communist Party?
I must refuse to answer that question, basing my refusal upon the privilege granted to me in the Fifth Amendment.
Thousands were called before committees, from party leaders to fellow travelers to those who had merely signed petitions. Most communists and former party members used the Fifth Amendment's defense against self-incrimination to protect them from having to reveal any connection to the party or from having to name others. The refusal to cooperate often cost people jobs and even careers. But in deciding not to defend themselves as communists, Kristol, Glazer, and Bell felt party members were once again, as in the days of the Popular Front, hiding their true beliefs in order to gain the support of liberals.
Instead of saying we are communists, we have a right to be communists, we defy you, these are our ideas, you are trying to destroy us, they didn't. They fudged. They took Fifth Amendment or denied.
The left had much to gain from hysteria about McCarthy. The communists were using the red baiting very successfully to whip up all the sympathy they could for communists. I mean, having been a Trotskyist was a great advantage. I understood what communists were. But not a lot of American liberals didn't.
In Commentary magazine, assistant editor Irving Kristol argued that liberal outrage against McCarthy's attacks on political dissent was blinding liberals to the problem with communism.
He exaggerated the extent to which liberals in general had become susceptible to the being fellow travelers to, as it were, the communist virus. And I think the conclusion was a sort of defense of McCarthy.
For there is one thing Americans know about Senator McCarthy. He, like them, is unequivocally anti-communist. About the spokesman for American liberalism, they feel they know no such thing, and with some justification. Irving Kristol, Commentary Magazine.
I was writing an article attacking fellow traveling liberals, fellow traveling journalists and intellectuals. These people were not communists. They just didn't think that communism was any kind of threat to anything. They were foolish, and so I attacked them. I did not dissociate myself from McCarthy as vigorously as I should have. I did. I referred to him as a vulgar demagogue. I thought that was enough. But a lot of the liberals thought I should have made my position clearer. And a lot of liberals thought this is no time to attack liberals. We should all get together and just attack McCarthy, which was the communist line. But that was not our line. And it was not my line.
He knew that McCarthy was a thug. He knew McCarthy didn't use nice methods, and McCarthy wasn't someone with whom Kristol would have wanted to associate personally. But the anti-communism of the moment was becoming so uninflected, so coarse, that it even found a kind of backhanded apology, if that's the phrase to use, for McCarthyism.
Though also anti-communist, Irving Howe felt that his fellow New York intellectuals and their attacks on communists were overlooking the danger McCarthy posed to civil liberties.
My friends and I had no fondness for the American communists. Politically, we were bitter opponents, but we took a strict civil libertarian position. We were against all the persecutions of the communists. We felt it was playing into their hands. We felt it was a violation of American traditions and principles. We looked upon McCarthyism as a thing of ugliness.
If you were to...
I think the real issue is the fact that the party took an unprincipled stand against an unprincipled adversary. And they both played each other's game this way. And the liberals were being caught between them.
I don't think you understood the question. The question was, do you know this man? Can you look at the picture and tell us whether you know him?
People will tell you that it was possible to be anti-McCarthy and anti-Stalinist. The problem was, when you look at what they did, they were anti-Stalinist, and they denounced McCarthyism in some general, fundamental way. But they also, in effect, threw other folks on the left who had been involved with so-called fellow traveling organizations or the party itself, they threw them to the wolves. It seems to me that if one is trying to ask what is a moral, political position for those years, it didn't add up to one.
I am not and never have been disloyal. I am...
That innocent people could be hurt, yes. But the crucial point, seems to me, is the fact that what is one supposed to do in this situation? Keep quiet? We were, in effect, saying McCarthy was wrong. So in what sense were we legitimizing or not being aware of civil liberties?
You know, Sidney Hook and I wrote a letter to the Times saying we should start a movement to force Senator McCarthy to resign from public life. That's what I thought of McCarthy. But how you deal with communists was another matter.
I think it was a very difficult situation. I am not easy with overall the position no, there wasn't a joint position. Our attack on communism and the legitimacy of showing up the errors of the communists under attack was so forceful that we really didn't come to the issue of civil rights and the nature of the attackers. What position do we take towards the fact that they're being cross-examined on their views, they're getting fired from positions, they're going abroad to continue their work, and so on? Well, even at the time, and also in retrospect, we never managed to figure out a good position. I thought we never. By good, I mean not one that that was politically defensible, but that was respectable and moral and responsive to all the complicated issues raised. And I still don't think we have one.
We had been raised, it seemed, with our mother's milk, with the idea that the function of the intellectual was to stand apart from the dominant institutions of society, to be a critic, even if it meant being marginal in the world. In the 50s, this impulse, which had been The animating value of the whole partisan review group since the middle 1930s began slowly to weaken.
McCarthyism created an uneasy relationship with official anti-communism for the four men. But Bell, Glazer, and Kristol were impressed by the government's opposition to Soviet power. Joined with their de-radicalization, this led them to a stronger embrace of American society and its values, triggering another debate between Howe and his old friends.
Irving thought that a lot of the Cold War intellectuals, including former friends from Alcove 1, by virtue of being opponents of communism, they were joining in a great celebration of America. And it seemed to Irving an unwarranted celebration.
In 1954, I published an article called This Age of Conformity, a kind of scattershot attack on the whole intellectual world for losing its tradition of intellectual independence, its social radicalism, its passion for criticism.
What I find invidious, and I don't think Irving meant it that way, but it always gets put forth that way, particularly from the outside, is a moralistic element. I am moral, you are not. I've retained my ideals, you have not. Well, that's nonsense, because it assumes somehow that a change in the point of view is a surrender of certain ideals.
I lived in the same building with Irving Howe, talking about conformism. Which one of us was conforming? What he was objecting to was the fact that I had ceased being radical. So we invented something called conformity. What was I conforming to? To what? I mean, I could never get an answer to that question. To the idea that America was a good country? I had had that belief years before.
The tendency in the intellectual world in the 1950s was toward conformity, was toward making peace with the status quo, or the status quo of American capitalist society, and I was against that. In 1953, we started magazine Dissent, which would be a voice of independent socialist thought, but not affiliated to any organization.
Freed of his old radical desire for revolution, Howe sought to understand the socialist tradition in a democratic context. The pages of Dissent became a forum for rethinking the idea of socialism in America. Through the magazine, he brought together a community of like-minded radicals, intent on attacking the inequalities of American society.
You know Irving's line, when intellectuals have nothing else to do, they start a magazine. There was a sense of nothing else to do, nothing out in the world, nothing political in the old sense of political to do. And they wanted to rethink the whole socialist project. And they also wanted to criticize American society.
I was uninterested in it. I just thought it was utterly irrelevant. It echoes from the past. I never took it seriously. I never read it regularly. And it didn't exist on my horizon.
They were very intemperate in a polemical, nasty way against people who had already abandoned socialism, and they fell into easy Marxist modes of denunciation, sellouts, and so on. We were all becoming professors, so I couldn't see why one group of professors should attack another group.
By the 50s, their work was bringing them increasing attention. Kristol's political essays had gained him a growing reputation, as did his work in London as co-editor of a new cultural magazine, Encounter. Howe published an important book, Politics and the Novel, and was instrumental in a revival of Yiddish literature. Glazer's interest in sociology led to his work on The Lonely Crowd, a widely praised book on American society, and to his own landmark study on ethnicity, Beyond the Melting Pot. Bell's essays on labor and politics culminated in Work and Its Discontents, and The End of Ideology, a classic book predicting the death of grand ideologies like Marxism. Universities were rapidly expanding after the war. After years of anti-Semitism, they were suddenly hiring Jews. Neither Bell, Howe, nor Glazer had received graduate degrees at the time, but they all found jobs.
For the New York intellectuals during their early years, the university was another version of American conformity, of narrowness. When the New Yorkers were welcomed into the universities, they began to see the universities as refuges for the kind of free development of ideas that previously they thought could only occur outside the university.
I got an education when I began teaching at the University of Chicago, and for the first time began to appreciate an education and try to convey this to students. What is the university if not a place of intellectual debate?
Newly established, middle-aged, convinced of the limitations of political action, in the 1960s, the four men found themselves confronted by a small group of radicals springing up on the university campuses they had made home. Drawing inspiration from the Southern Civil Rights Movement in which many had participated, the members of the newly created Students for a Democratic Society placed their hope for political change in the kind of direct action taken by young blacks in the South. Opposed to the Cold War, they were directly at odds with the liberal anti-communism of the New York intellectuals.
No younger generation likes to feel that it's being lectured to by their parents, ideological parents or biological parents, especially if they think those parents have a lot to answer to themselves.
The question is, whose views shall prevail today? The majority of people in this country are my age and younger. The people who run this country are people whose ideas were formed during the 20s and 30s.
Tom Hayden came to see me after he graduated Michigan. He'd read The End of Ideology. He was curious. And he was sort of caught between Wright Mills and myself. Those were his two poles, in a way. And clearly he chose Mills. But what struck me most about Hayden, apart from the personality of the man, which I never liked, somebody once called him the Richard Nixon of the left, which I think is a very good appellation for Hayden, that these were people who had lost a sense of historical memory. The 30s were sort of lost in the fog. The 50s were confused for them, and they thought they were coming out of themselves.
We thought that the Cold War was draining democracy, that civil rights were not a reality in the South, poverty could not be solved within the framework of the welfare state, and we didn't understand why they were defending a system that seemed preposterous to us. And I think it was because they put their lives into achieving it.
One of the things that the New York intellectuals most disliked was any form of romantic utopianism or romantic revolutionism, something that they felt they'd fought the good fight over in the 1930s and 1940s. They themselves had come to a much more hard-bitten, pragmatic, reformist view of society, and here these young radicals of the 60s came along with a resurrection of all of these, what they thought were naive, romantic, utopian, moral visions.
I think what motivates the new radicals, and to this extent it's a positive side, is a very deep moral feeling. Dismay at the hierarchies of work, at the competitiveness of the society, some of the materialism of the society, and all the criticisms are put in moral terms. The difficulty is the inability to translate a moral conception into a political conception.
And they had this lovely phrase about participatory democracy, that people ought to have the right to control the decisions which affect their lives, and it sounded fine. But then when one said to them, if you have a Southerner who doesn't want to break up his life and accept blacks, or as in Boston, you have people in the Southie who don't want blacks to come in, do they have a right to affect the decisions which affect their lives? There was a lack of complexity in their political ideas.
It was a response to the impersonality, the bureaucratization, the abstraction of life. Participatory democracy was an idea that said talk is a good idea, freedom is an endless meeting.
In the early 60s, relations between my gang, that is Around Dissent, and the SDS were quite good. There was a sort of democratic, socialistic view with which we could easily be in harmony.
After their years of isolation in the 50s, Howe and his fellow socialists at Dissent reached out to the young radicals of Students for a Democratic Society, hoping to find in them a new group of allies.
Five SDS leaders met with 5 Dissent editors in a mansion right off Central Park. Several of us, at least on the SDS side, came with a sense of reverence and antagonism combined. These were the fathers we were meeting with. And at the same time, they were the proprietors of the left, such as it was.
There was a lot of hope that it's a feature of a group like the Dissent group that they start, even though they were then in their 30s and 40s, they start looking for successors early on. It had to be the case that Irving would ask these young people, what is your attitude toward the Soviet Union, the revolution in Cuba, the Maoists in China? And these kids, they resented what they thought was an insistence that they recite a catechism.
Some of them seemed to us very idealistic. Perhaps the most gifted among them, Tom Hayden, was someone who we felt had a very strong authoritarian, manipulative streak. We could see the commissar in him, and that put us off.
Tom was defending nonviolence, and Tom at that point was an absolutist about nonviolence. And Irving was more or less baiting him. Could you love a fascist, Tom? And Tom insisted that he could. And to Irving, this was incomprehensible.
I was not raised in, thankfully, a household of people yelling at each other about the correct line. And so I couldn't comprehend the decibel level that these people would reach. And also they reminded you in a sick way of your father. You know, they were very, paternalism, this is beyond Abraham. I mean, paternalism to an extreme that I'd never heard of. People pointing at you and lecturing to you, and they didn't appear to be doing anything. And we were going to jail, so at least we knew we were on the right track.
When he heard Tom's toughness, what he thought was Tom's posturing as a hero, he heard Stalinism. Irving was a brutal debater. He was really revolted by what he was hearing, and he was unrestrained in his expression.
Probably we made a lot of tactical blunders. We were avuncular, we were impatient, we scolded, but at the same time, we wanted to influence them.
We thought, I certainly thought then, that they'd become frozen in their thought. And it was the freezing of their thought that had encapsulated them in a kind of inaction that we were eager to extricate ourselves from.
There's an inevitable conflict between generations, but I think that to reduce the differences between them and us to a generational conflict is a rather superficial way of looking upon it.
Irving saw something more than just the generational conflict. He saw a group of young people who, because they were unwilling or unable to learn from his experience, from other people's experience, were going to repeat the mistakes of the left.
When I came to Berkeley in 1963-64, I still thought of myself as a man of the left. The students I were closest to were people who did believe in organizing people.
Nathan Glazer arrived at the University of California, a self-described liberal with radical tendencies. He had protested against the nuclear arms race and was sympathetic to the Berkeley students who were demonstrating for civil rights in the Bay Area. Then, a ban on campus political activity led Berkeley itself to become the target of protests over the right to free speech.
At least for the first few months of the free speech issue, I always felt like I was on the side of the free speech people. But there came a time when I felt that the push against institutional authority was simply excessive.
We were serious students, and we were treated by the Nathan Glazers of the world as if we were not, and that was insulting. When I first met Nathan Glazer, I was in absolute awe of him. You know, I'd read his books, thought, ooh, wow, you know, this is my advisor, ooh, you know, big time. And I was a little afraid of him. As time went on, it became apparent to me that we had a major philosophical difference. And at first it was just we would chat about it. And then we would argue about it, you know, and it was, and he was decidedly angry and hostile. He thought we were wrecking the university, destroying the university.
The degree of their discontent was disproportionate to the situation, disproportionate to the point of where one distrusted their bona fides. Is this really bothering you so much, or after something else?
Administration resistance to the call for free speech convinced protesters that direct action was the only means to change the university. When students finally occupied the school's main administration building, Glazer became one of the free speech movement's most vocal opponents.
I have an announcement. This assemblage has developed to such a point that the purpose and work of the university have been materially impaired.
There was a kind of, I felt, enthusiastic and euphoric rejection of forms and norms, but taunting of seeing to what extent one could put this institution and its representatives off balance, which was not a legitimate way to conduct the argument, the discussion, unless one thought it was such a reprehensible institution that anything you do to show it up is correct.
Their view was, you know, lift your voice, take pen in hand, write a letter to the editor, speak in Congress, stand up and be heard, and if the system says no, you say, win some, lose some. And we thought that was just bankrupt. The liberalism that they espoused was an armchair intellectual liberalism. You shouldn't really get your hands dirty, because if you get your hands dirty, then God, could get out of control, and they were control freaks. The last thing in the world you ever want is, for something to maybe get out of control. Terrified of the mob.
There are certain key issues which, regardless of any other position you have, label you forever. And the key issue that labeled me a conservative, labeled a number of us a conservative, were the student unrest issues post-64. And it didn't matter that you were more expenditure on the poor. These things became irrelevant because certain things became crucial. Just like today, your position on affirmative action becomes crucial. I mean, nothing else matters. Call yourself what you will. That is what will determine who you are.
I have just sent a telegram to the President and the Attorney General. For every hour and day that passes, more human beings, American and Vietnamese, die needlessly in that ugly war. And for every hour and day that passes, more members of our generation become desperate and hopeless in their search for the decent society.
By 1965, seeking to prevent the spread of communism, President Lyndon Johnson had committed troops to fight in the Asian country of South Vietnam. A growing anti-war movement catalyzed SDS, turning the organization into a mass movement among the young. Thousands protested the war across the country, and by 1968, anti-war sentiment forced Johnson to abandon his race for another term. Frustration with Johnson's liberal administration turned into anger with American power. A small group of radicals turning toward the old Marxist theories of the left began to blame American capitalism and American society for the war.
when the critics of the Vietnam War, and I was a critic all the way, from the very beginning to the very end, and wrote a number of joint organizations, so on. But the critics of the Vietnam War looked at the matter as a kind of attempt of American capitalism to save itself. I mean, I thought this was just stupid.
Burn the back flag! Burn the back flag!
We thought the United States on the whole was a good society. Now, it may have taken us a while to get to that point, but we did. And when we saw this attack launched in the most extreme terms, we simply didn't understand what they were arguing about.
We felt very strongly that by 1968 or so, the New Left people were not engaged in intellectual discussion or debate or political struggle with us. They were out to destroy our bona fide. They were out to deny that we had a right, so to speak, to exist. And this was one of the ways in which the idea of confrontation took place.
Student anger over Vietnam began to erupt on college campuses. In 1968, radicals attacked Columbia University, where Daniel Bell had been on the faculty for 10 years.
Columbia in the 60s had been a remarkable school. People like Hofstadter, Trilling, Meyer Shapiro had a glow, had intellectual excitement. And yet all this was simply kicked away. To take the university as a target, as somehow this was complicit with what was all wrong with the world, was ludicrous.
Columbia had a way of containing within it most of the problems of American society. We were against the war, and we were against inequity in American society, but we had in our own administration an example of what was worst about our society, and we could confront it by confronting it right at home.
Bell was part of a Columbia faculty that included fellow New York intellectuals Lionel Trilling, Meyer Shapiro, and F.W. Dupee. In 1968, a university gym being built in a public park in Harlem provoked student accusations of racism. In April, a protest led to the occupation of campus buildings and to a larger attack on the university and its ties to a think tank doing military research. Bell saw the students' actions as a threat to the intellectual life of the school.
The university is a very fragile institution. There are very few institutions which have that degree of continuity which allow for discussion, debate, free exchange of ideas, and to assume that it's only a manipulative instrument of a ruling class is ludicrous. There are elements of it, reproduction of a class structure, all these things are partly true, but they had no sense of what the university was as a community.
Those who were criticizing us, the senior faculty, were very privileged members of the university. Their whole attitude toward society was in many ways determined by their relationship to the university. So they could be liberal in relation to the Vietnam War, but when the university itself was criticized, then their very privileged position was also shaken.
We find our lives being governed by men who do not understand the problems of the day.
In the midst of the occupation, Bell and several other faculty were asked by Columbia administrators to try to negotiate a settlement, which the students did not accept.
I remember coming back after a discussion with David Truman, who I respected, and saying, look, whatever you do, don't call on the police. The police will run riot and simply break heads. He said, what do you want to do? I said, go in and argue with them. I just had a debate with a man named Szymanski about Marxism and sociology. Lionel Trilling had a debate. I said, you have to go and argue with them. He said, I'm not going to argue with those kids with the temper tantrums. I said, look, David, you cannot assert authority, you have to earn authority. He said, nonsense.
We were very angry when the police were brought on campus and beat us and took us to jail and sent us to the hospital by the hundreds. If that hadn't been so coherent with the policy of the Columbia administration throughout its entire tenure, we would have been shocked, but we weren't shocked. We were just enraged.
I can only tell you, Pearl can tell you, when that happened, 2 o'clock in the morning, Lyle and I walked down the hill. He lived on Claremont, I lived in the Drive. I came home and burst into tears. Unfortunately, I think the events of '68 destroyed Columbia. It tore the faculty apart. It left a reign of bad feeling. A lot of us left afterwards. I've been offered a job at Harvard before, then I said no. Afterwards, there was so much bad feeling. I decided it's hard to live here.
The 1960s were full of big ideas, most of them fantasies. And we decided to have this magazine, which would take a very realistic, somewhat skeptical view of social policy. I and Dan Bell got together and we started the Public Interest. We started a magazine. It's the only thing I could think to do. I didn't run for office. We started a magazine on a shoestring. We had a circulation of a few hundred to begin with. That didn't bother us. A circulation of a few hundred, you could change the world.
As radicals attacked liberals for their resistance to change, Kristol, Bell, and Glazer became convinced by the mid-60s that liberals were trying to create change too quickly. Promising a war on poverty and inequality, Lyndon Johnson had initiated a host of government social programs. The three felt that the administration's liberal beliefs, its ideology, had obscured an awareness of the limits of what social policy could achieve. Bringing together a group of like-minded intellectuals, they wanted to examine the consequences of government policy using the methods of social science, and they wanted to have an impact on those who made it.
Public Interest was, in its origin, still a liberal magazine, but without a liberal ideology.
Being ideological means you have prefabricated ideas. You cut and trim the ideas to fit the formula. And insofar as we were trying to show that these problems are much more complex than most people realize, and needed some kind of database, if you want to put it that way, some more thorough analysis, that had to be non-ideological.
It was true, and New York was poor. It had 1/10 as many people on welfare. So now how were they managing? And they managed. I mean, there were societies, there were organizations, there were friends, there were... how did they manage? They must have managed poorly. But now they must be managing much better now. Think of the sums involved. Well, are they managing much better? So they're very complicated effects, and that's what we were in, that's what we were at.
Recoiling from 60s radicalism, critical of democratic social policy, Kristol, Glazer, and Bell found themselves increasingly on the margins of liberalism. By 1972, the Democratic Party, under pressure from 60s radicals, moved further left. Anti-war candidate George McGovern ultimately won the Democratic nomination, pledging an expansion of the social programs begun under the Great Society.
Just before we went to Europe in 1972, Gertrude Himmelfarb, who is Mrs. Irving Kristol, as you know, phoned to ask whether we would give our names to an ad in the New York Times for Nixon. I had much criticism of McGovern, but I wouldn't dream of giving my name to Nixon, and neither would Lionel. But this ad ran, and there were Democrats. This ad was Democrats for Nixon. Now, this was the beginning. I think this very thing was the beginning of the neoconservative movement. And they went on to become a very vocal force in American life with the Republican victories in the White House.
As time went by, Bell argued about issues more and more with his fellow editor. Though critical of McGovern, he chose to vote Democratic. With this disagreement over the election, he finally left the Public Interest. Though Glazer had also withheld his support from Nixon, he continued working with Kristol and replaced Bell as an editor of the magazine. Over the next decade, neoconservative influence helped create a resurgent conservative movement culminating in Ronald Reagan's presidency and a rightward shift in the American political landscape.
The neocons taught the conservatives. It seems to me that the expertise associated with sociology was introduced by this set of people with some force in the 60s and 70s, i.e., they taught us, certainly they taught me, methods of the organization of social data, which I wasn't familiar with, in part because the conservative message had at that point become so platonic, models.
It seems to me that increasingly the neoconservatives were in the grip of an ideology, and the ideology was the ideology of the free market. And they seemed to me to be Bolsheviks in the way they adopted and defended and promoted this ideology.
In the coming decade or so, the political struggles will not be any longer between democratic capitalism and communist totalitarianism, but will now be a struggle between conservatism, Thatcherite conservatism, or Reaganite or Kristolite conservatism on the one hand, and social democracy on the other.
I became radical because I thought I had good reason to be radical. I became liberal because I thought I had good reason to become liberal. And then I became conservative because I thought I had good reason to be conservative. It seems to me perfectly natural. You get social justice in the hands of the government, and it's in the hands of ambitious politicians, and it becomes a profession. Social justice should not be a profession. I believe that we should encourage people to do what they should do to help people to the degree that people can be helped. And to the degree that they can't be helped, they can't be helped.
Irving has a commitment to conservatism as a political movement that I do not have. I don't feel that it is important that the Republican Party triumph. I have been a critic of liberal social policy, but more in regret. So in that sense, I maintain a much more of an affiliation with the world of liberal social policy than other people who are called neoconservative. I look at policies that try to improve welfare. I think that you must keep on trying even if you haven't had great success.
Liberalism has no fixed dogmas. It has no fixed points. You say, this is the liberal position. It changes because it's an attitude. It's a skepticism, it's a pluralism, it's agnostic. It's curious that you ask me, am I a conservative, am I a neoconservative? What I find amusing is that people who decry a one-dimensional view of society apply a one-dimensional label. I believe there are different realms in a society, and there are different principles which underlie these realms. That's why I've called myself a socialist in economics, a liberal in politics, and a conservative in culture.
By the 80s, Bell was driven to reassert his liberal beliefs in the face of a newly powerful conservative movement. In his later work, drawing on a tradition going back to Marx, he attempted to grasp the essence of social change in his era, charting the coming of post-industrial society.
Many people in sociology and other fields are very reluctant to connect their moral and political judgments with their professional work. Dan Bell offers the example of somebody who has really achieved an enormous amount, not by ruling all these considerations out of order, but instead by using them to suggest what are important things to be studying. What do we need to understand about this world in order to see where we're going?
Writing steadily on literary subjects from Emerson to T.S. Eliot, in the 70s, Howe also helped found the Democratic Socialists of America, continuing his search for greater economic equality. In World of Our Fathers, an acclaimed study of Jewish politics and immigrant life, he found his way back to the vanished culture of his youth, discovering there the lost source for his own socialism.
It's certainly true that right now the idea of socialism does not loom as a central issue in American political life, and that's putting it mildly. So we have to remind ourselves, lest we become too busy with our daily tasks, that we live and we work by a deeper standard, a larger vision.
To me, socialism is no longer a dogma or an ideology, but it's a vision, a hope, an expectation for a world in which there will be greater equality, common ownership of major industries by people who work in industries, a gradual transformation from the ethic of accumulation and me-ism.
All of us at Dissent, and Irving has been one of the most persistent in this, hold on to socialism by continually redefining.
American capitalism.
We think it's important to retain a sense that social life is malleable through political action, even if visions of radical transformation turn out to be wrong.
Have I become a pessimist about the ability to change society? Yes. That, I think, is... there's no way of getting away from that. I am not against government keeping on trying, but just what those efforts should be, we're still struggling to find out.
Over the last 2 decades, Glazer's work has been instrumental in helping reshape the social policy debate in Washington. Informed by a pragmatic sensibility, his approach to issues such as welfare and affirmative action have produced a body of political ideas caught between the liberal and conservative worlds.
Glazer's work embodies a lot of the original promise of neoconservatism and of the public interest, which was to be pointedly non-ideological, to reject ideology, and to say we're going to try to look at problems and policies fresh.
Now, you say, is the answer to that special situation affirmative action?
After being very critical of affirmative action all his life, he could still say, we can't really get rid of it entirely because we do have a debt to African Americans.
Irving has been enormously influential in the minds and purposes of many members of the political class, I think. Well, he explains the world. He takes positions on the nature of the world and on the big questions. And it's those big questions that direct the purposes of the people who fill government jobs. And he has been relentless in his efforts to improve the analysis of public policy so that policies will achieve the goals that they intend to. But he wouldn't want to do it, of course not, because he's in his very essence an intellectual.
Assuming we can scrape through the spring issue, we'll have a summer issue, and then in the fall we have our special 30th anniversary issue.
Kristol, with his background in Marxism, understood the importance of intellectuals on policy, the way that their views a few years later will filter down into the mainstream, and he was able to convince foundations and corporations, instead of ignoring intellectuals, actually to buy intellectuals and to set up these think tanks and foundations.
In the 70s and 80s, Kristol helped create a new generation of conservative writers. In a series of essays, he explored his belief in the importance of traditional morality and religion, and became a champion of the growing political participation of the religious right.
The notion that a purely secular society can cope with all of the terrible pathologies that now affect our society, I think has turned out to be false, and that has made me culturally conservative. I mean, I really think religion has a role now to play in redeeming the country, and liberalism is not prepared to give religion a role. Conservatism is, but it doesn't know how to do it.
In terms of my own sense of it, Irving's become completely ideological. If anything, by now, this is sort of the radical difference between us. It's become a crusade for him, and therefore become more aggressive in his point of view. Fair enough, but at least it's more of a crusade rather than a skeptical examination of issues.
I don't know whether that's true or not. Hard to see this sort of thing about oneself. I accept certain principles of political philosophy, which I didn't accept 25 years ago. But I don't regard that as ideology. I have become interested in trying to develop a conservative agenda because I think in democratic politics, with societies in flux as they are, you do need an agenda to keep up with change.
He did an article in the National Interest about a year and a half ago, which absolutely did me aghast. He said, "For me, the Cold War is not over. To me, it's now a war against liberalism." And I blink. I say, well, I can be critical of liberalism, but a war against liberalism? Why? Well, liberalism is responsible for the moral decay of the country. Well, this I find quite wrong. If there's a sense of decay, it's been in the ethics of so much, not all, but so much of these business corporations, and the way in which they've simply lived lives of total luxury and spoliation. Not a word of condemnation of this. So moral decay is always the poor blacks, homosexuals, others, as a form of family values, and nothing on the other side.
If you would ask anyone, any liberal, in 1960, we are going to pass these laws, these laws, these laws, and these laws, mentioning all the laws that in fact were passed in the 1960s and 70s, would you say crime will go up, drug addiction will go up, illegitimacy will go up, or will they get down? Everyone would have said, obviously, they will get down. And everyone would have been wrong. Now, that's not something that the liberals have been able to face up to. They had their reforms, and they have led to consequences that they did not expect and they don't know what to do about. And the conservatives, I must say, at the moment are only slightly better off in that they don't bear responsibility for the reforms, so at least they're willing to look at them. But there's still a lot of work to be done among conservatives in creating some sort of an agenda for a decent society.
It is assumed when you deal with people in the academy that engagement is not necessarily part of their work. They are professional. I feel when I read something by Bell or by Kristol, I am reading something that counts more than when I read other things. Now, if you were to press me and say, why does it count more? Because I know them, I know where they're coming from, I know where they're going to, I respect them. All those things are part of it. But it simply counts more. I know it's just not another stroke in a kind of professional inquiry or something of that sort. And I suppose the answer is the assumption is the involvement is a passionate one.
Is there a tie that binds all the people who 50 years ago were in Alcove 1 at City College with people like Danny Bell and Seymour Melman and even someone like Nat Glazer, even though he's quite a bit to the right of us? I do feel very strong ties. I have various disagreements with, say, Bell, but I feel a strong tie with him. With Kristol, I feel no longer any tie whatever. He has gone over way to the other side. He's a spokesman for corporate interests for the Republican Party. I look upon him as a political opponent. And the fact that we were together 50 years ago doesn't stir the faintest touch of sentiment in me. I wish him well personally, lead a long life with many political failures, I hope.
I have tried these last weeks at all hours of the day to evoke Irving's voice, its cadence, its fluency, and a freshness of tone that the years never made stale.
Our friend and comrade Irving Howe is dead. The world knew him as the leading intellectual of the American left, a voice, often as they say, a voice in the wilderness, We knew him differently. He was our voice. It's our wilderness. I know that voice. It's in my bones. Irving taught us to argue and to worry. Most of us, I suppose, never worried enough because we always knew that he was worrying. Worrying steadily, worrying with a purpose, for he was also stubbornly and strangely and sometimes luminously hopeful.